close your eyes, take a breath in, hold it for a moment, and let it go. There is a man sitting in a Tokyo apartment who once held more Bitcoin than anyone else on Earth. He didn't steal it. He didn't sell it. He didn't gamble it away in some reckless bet on a market he didn't understand. He simply lost it. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment that he could point to later and say, that was when it happened. It slipped away slowly, quietly, over years, like water seeping through a cracked container, drip by drip, transaction by transaction. And by the time anyone fully understood what had been happening, 850,000 Bitcoin were gone. At the prices Bitcoin would eventually reach, that would be worth somewhere in the range of $80 billion. But this story is not really about the money. Or rather, it is not only about the money. It is about something stranger, and in some ways more disturbing than a simple theft. It is about what happens when the most important piece of financial infrastructure in the early life of a new technology is placed in the hands of someone who was never supposed to be holding it. It is about a website that began its existence as a marketplace for fantasy trading cards and became, through a series of improbable accidents and opportunities, the gateway through which most of the world's Bitcoin flowed. And it is about the moment, in the cold February of 2014, when that gateway collapsed and nearly took an entire technology with it. Get comfortable. Let your body settle into wherever you are resting. This story begins with a card game. In 2006, a programmer named Jed McCaleb had an idea. Jed was a developer, smart, restless, the kind of person whose mind moved quickly from one project to the next, who built things because he could and moved on when the building was done. He had grown up in the American South, gone to the University of California at Berkeley, and emerged with a combination of technical skill and entrepreneurial restlessness that made him well suited for the early internet era. His idea in 2006 was simple: a website where people could trade Magic: The Gathering cards online. Magic: The Gathering is a collectible card game that was created in the early 1990s and had, by the mid-2000s, developed a vast and passionate global following. The game has a secondary market that rivals some traditional investment markets in its complexity. Rare cards can be worth hundreds of dollars. Extremely rare cards can be worth thousands. The market for these cards is fragmented. Players and collectors buy and sell through individual forums, local game shops, and various informal channels. And Jed thought he saw an opportunity to create something more organized. He bought the domain name mtox.com. The name was an abbreviation, Magic: The Gathering Online Exchange. The website never quite worked. Jed built it, tested it, looked at the results, and moved on. He was a builder, not an operator. The domain sat dormant, pointed at nothing in particular, the card game exchange that never quite became a card game exchange. And then, in 2010, Jed encountered something that changed everything about how he thought about markets and technology. He encountered Bitcoin. Bitcoin in 2010 was barely 2 years old. The person who had created it, whoever Satoshi Nakamoto actually was, had published the original white paper in 2008 and launched the network in January 2009. The technology was real, the code was running, but the ecosystem around it was almost non-existent. There was no easy way to buy Bitcoin with regular money. There was no exchange, no marketplace, no institution that would let you convert dollars or euros or yen into the new digital currency. If you wanted Bitcoin, you either mined it yourself, which required running specialized software on your computer, or you found someone willing to sell it to you directly, person to person, in the small online forums where the early community gathered. Jed read the white paper, he read the forum posts, he looked at the code, and he understood. In the way that people with a talent for recognizing early-stage technological potential sometimes understand things before others, that this was significant. He also understood something more immediately practical. Bitcoin needed an exchange. It needed a place where people could buy and sell it easily with regular currencies without having to find a trading partner through a forum post. And Jed already had a domain name. He already knew how to build a trading platform. He had already built one, more or less, for a card game. He repurposed mtgox.com into a Bitcoin exchange, almost as an afterthought, as a side project built on the skeleton of something else entirely. The name stayed. Magic the Gathering online exchange became, in the public imagination, simply Mt. Gox, a name that would eventually be recognized around the world not for cards, but for catastrophe. In its earliest days, Mt. Gox was extraordinarily primitive, even by the standards of what was available at the time. The security was minimal. The interface was basic. The code was, by the later accounts of people who examined it in the aftermath of its collapse, alarming in its simplicity. Error handling was poor, edge cases were unaddressed. The kind of redundancy and robustness that any serious financial system requires was simply absent. But Jed was not trying to build a serious financial system. He was building a website, a useful website for a small and growing community. And by the standards of useful websites for small and growing communities, it worked well enough. In those early months, Bitcoin itself was worth almost nothing. A single Bitcoin could be purchased for a few cents. The people trading on the early Mt. Gox were enthusiasts, technologists, people who believed they were participating in the early stages of something important, not investors seeking returns, but pioneers exploring new territory. Jed ran the exchange himself in his spare time. He answered support emails, he fixed bugs when they appeared, he kept the lights on, and because the alternative was nothing, the community used it. By mid-2010, Mt. Gox was handling the majority of all Bitcoin transactions in the world. Not because it was particularly good, because it was there, and almost nothing else was. This is a pattern that repeats throughout the history of cryptocurrency. The first mover advantage in a new market is enormous. Not because the first product is the best product, it almost never is, but because people who need a service will use whatever service exists, and once they are using it, the inertia of familiarity keeps them there. Mt. Gox was not the best possible exchange for Bitcoin. It was the exchange that existed, and so it became, by default, the exchange that mattered. Jed, being Jed, quickly lost interest in running an exchange. Managing customer support was not the part of building things that he enjoyed. Maintaining a financial platform was not the kind of challenge that kept him engaged. He wanted to build the next thing. In March 2011, he sold Mt. Gox to a French developer named Karpelès, who lived in Tokyo. The sale price was reportedly around $400,000, a small amount even then for an exchange handling most of the world's Bitcoin. Some who knew the early Bitcoin community felt that Jed had significantly undervalued what he was selling. Jed would go on to co-found Ripple and later Stellar, two cryptocurrency projects that would themselves become significant. He had a gift for being early and a habit of leaving before things got complicated. The complications, in the case of Mt. Gox, were only just beginning. No one paused as the ownership changed hands and the user base grew, and the Bitcoin flowing through the exchange reached into the tens of millions of dollars, to ask the obvious question. Why is a card game website handling all of this? Why is a card game website built in spare time by one person on a domain name originally purchased for something completely different, processing the majority of the world's Bitcoin transactions? No one asked. The community needed the service. The service existed, and that was enough. Karpelès was born in France in 1985. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, a genuinely unusual person. Someone who had moved to Japan in his mid-20s because he loved the country, its food, its culture, its particular blend of technological innovation and social orderliness. He had a cat named T-Bon, after whom he had named his holding company, T-Bon Limited, which would become the corporate entity that owned Mt. Gox. He baked his own bread, experimenting with recipes and techniques with the same methodical curiosity he brought to code. He was, by most accounts, a pleasant person to be around, calm, intellectually engaged, not given to the aggressive self-promotion that characterized many in the technology industry. He was also a genuinely talented programmer. People who worked alongside him or who examined his code described someone with real technical ability, someone who understood the deep structure of how software systems worked, who could spend hours in the details of an implementation and find his way around. What he was not, what he catastrophically was not, was a person suited to running a major financial institution. The difference between a programmer and the chief executive of a company handling billions of dollars in customer funds is not simply a difference of scale. It is a difference of kind. A financial institution requires legal compliance, regulatory engagement, security architecture, human resources, customer relations, risk management, and a dozen other disciplines that have nothing to do with writing good code. Mark came to Mt. Gox as a programmer. He remained a programmer. The company around him grew at a rate that left no time for him to become anything else. When Mark took over in 2011, Mt. Gox had a small number of users and was handling relatively modest transaction volumes. Within 2 years, it would become the exchange through which approximately 70% of all Bitcoin in the world was traded. The price of Bitcoin would rise from a few dollars to over $1,000. The exchange would be processing hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions every day. None of the systems, processes, or people that a company of this size needed were put in place fast enough. The legal structure was inadequate. The accounting systems were, at various points, so confused that no one had a reliable picture of how much Bitcoin the exchange actually held versus how much it owed to customers. The security architecture, the systems designed to protect customer funds from theft, was built by a programmer running a side project, and it showed. When employees raised concerns, they were often not heard. The culture of the company was deeply centralized around Mark. He was reluctant to delegate, reluctant to bring in outside expertise, reluctant to acknowledge that what he was running required capabilities he did not have. This is not unusual in the history of technology companies. Founders often struggle to transition from the person who built the product to the person who runs the company. What made Mt. Gox different was the nature of what it was holding. Mt. Gox was not holding user data, or software subscriptions, or advertising inventory. It was holding people's money, people's Bitcoin, savings that people had trusted to an institution they believed was safe. And while all of this was happening, while the company was failing to build the systems it needed, while the management was struggling to keep up with what it had become, something else was happening, quietly, in the background. Bitcoin was disappearing. The theft, if that is the right word for what happened, and the question of what exactly happened has never been fully resolved, did not begin with a single dramatic break-in. It began as a trickle. At some point in 2011, possibly earlier, the Bitcoin held in Mt. Gox's storage began to drain at a rate faster than the normal flow of customer withdrawals. A small amount here, a slightly larger amount there. The difference between what was deposited and what was actually present in the exchange's wallets was growing, slowly, day by day. The technical mechanism through which this happened involved what is known as a hot wallet, the portion of an exchange's cryptocurrency holdings that is kept online, connected to the internet, available for immediate processing of withdrawals. Hot wallets are, by their nature, more vulnerable to attack than cold storage. Funds kept entirely offline, on hardware disconnected from any network. Good security practice requires minimizing what is held in a hot wallet and moving excess funds regularly into cold storage. Mt. Gox's security practices were not good. The specific vulnerability that appears to have been exploited over those long years of quiet drainage is known as transaction malleability. It is a subtle and technical flaw in how Bitcoin transactions were processed that allowed an attacker to request a withdrawal, alter the transaction identifier before it was confirmed, and then claim the withdrawal had failed, prompting the exchange to send the Bitcoin again. Done once, this is a minor annoyance. Done thousands of times, systematically, over years, by someone who understood the vulnerability and had the patience to exploit it repeatedly, it becomes the theft of hundreds of millions of dollars. The troubling thing about this explanation, and it is only one of several theories about what happened at Mt. Gox, is that it requires either extraordinary negligence or extraordinary blindness on the part of management. A functioning accounting system would have noticed the growing gap between what was owed to customers and what was actually held. A functioning security system would have flagged the anomalous withdrawal patterns. Mt. Gox had neither. Or rather, it had the beginnings of both. Systems and processes that were, in principle, supposed to catch these things, but they were incomplete, poorly implemented, inadequately monitored. The gap between what the systems were supposed to do and what they were actually doing was itself invisible to the people who should have been watching. There was a moment in June 2011 when the scale of the security problem should have become undeniable. An attacker gained access to the computer of someone with administrative privileges on the Mt. Gox database. From that position, they manipulated the Bitcoin price on the exchange down to approximately 1 cent per Bitcoin. They then purchased an enormous quantity of Bitcoin at that fraudulent price and attempted to withdraw it. The withdrawal attempt was large enough to trigger automated limits. It was caught. The exchange was taken offline for several days. Security improvements were announced. Mark posted lengthy explanations. The community was reassured that the problem was being addressed. The users came back. The Bitcoin kept flowing. The withdrawal limits were adjusted. And the slow drain that no one had noticed, that, in the chaos of responding to the visible attack, no one had thought to look for, continued. There is something almost unbearable about reconstructing this timeline. Looking back, with the knowledge of what eventually happened, you can see the moments where things could have been caught, where a different question asked, a different system implemented, a different person brought in to look at the numbers, might have revealed what was happening while there was still time to do something about it. But the people inside Mt. Gox were not looking back. They were looking forward, at a booming market, at growing user numbers, at a company that seemed to be succeeding. The gap in the vault was invisible from where they were standing. In the middle of all of this, the security failures, the confused accounting, the quiet drain of customer Bitcoin, something else was happening inside Mt. Gox that made the situation considerably stranger. Among traders who used the exchange regularly in 2012 and 2013, there had long been whispers about unusual patterns in the trading data. The Bitcoin price on Mt. Gox was, at various times, higher than on competing exchanges. There seemed to be a buyer, an unusually persistent, unusually mechanical buyer, who appeared during odd hours and who never seemed to run out of money. These observations were noted on forums, discussed in trading communities, and largely dismissed. Unusual patterns in markets are common. Algorithmic trading bots were becoming more prevalent. It was easy to assume that whatever you were seeing had an ordinary explanation. After the collapse, when investigators and journalists and independent researchers were able to examine Mt. Gox's internal trading data, which had been partially leaked and partially disclosed during legal proceedings, the The picture that emerged was extraordinary. There were two bots operating inside the Mt. Gox system. Traders who analyzed the data gave them names: Marcus and Willy. Marcus appeared first in 2011. It was a trading bot that purchased Bitcoin using accounts that were denominated in US dollars. But the dollars did not exist. They had not been deposited by any real customer. They were entries in Mt. Gox's internal ledger, numbers that the system treated as real because someone with access to the system had created them. Marcus was buying Bitcoin with invented money. Willy appeared in 2013 and was more aggressive, more systematic, and more consequential. Over approximately 6 months, Willy made over 142,000 individual Bitcoin purchases. The purchases were mechanical in their regularity, a fixed quantity bought at fixed intervals, regardless of price, regardless of market conditions, with the relentless indifference of a machine executing instructions. When researchers plotted the trading activity against the public Bitcoin price during this period, the correlation was striking. The periods of Willy's most intense activity coincided with periods of Bitcoin price inflation. The bot was, in effect, moving the market, buying consistently and mechanically in a way that pushed prices upward on Mt. Gox, and through the arbitrage mechanisms that connected cryptocurrency markets, influencing prices elsewhere as well. The question of who ran these bots and what the intention was has never been definitively answered to everyone's satisfaction. Mark Karpelès denied running the bots as a deliberate scheme to manipulate the market for personal profit. He would eventually acknowledge that the Marcus bot may have been connected to efforts to paper over the gap between what the exchange held and what it owed, to artificially inflate the apparent trading activity on the platform during a period when the true financial state would have alarmed users. In this reading of events, the bots were not a cynical scheme for enrichment, but a desperate and misguided attempt to manage a crisis that had already, by that point, become unmanageable. The Japanese courts, after years of legal proceedings, convicted Mark of data manipulation, acknowledging that the records of Mt. Gox had been altered in ways that constituted a crime. They acquitted him of embezzlement, the more serious charge that he had taken customer funds for personal use. The acquittal on embezzlement was read by some observers as a recognition that whatever had happened at Mt. Gox, it was more a case of catastrophic incompetence than deliberate theft. Others were not convinced by this distinction. The full truth of what happened inside Mt. Gox's systems during those years, who authorized what, who knew what was deliberate and what was accidental, may never be fully established. The records were incomplete. The code was poorly documented. Many of the people who had the most knowledge have been reluctant to speak clearly about what they saw. What we know with confidence is this: someone was creating Bitcoin transactions that did not correspond to real deposits. Someone was buying Bitcoin with money that did not exist. This was happening at scale for months in a system that had already been losing real customer Bitcoin through other means. The vault was both being emptied from outside and filled with fictional numbers from inside. The Bitcoin that customers had deposited on Mt. Gox was, by early 2014, almost entirely gone. The exchange owed its customers approximately 850,000 Bitcoin, around 750,000 belonging to customers, and roughly 100,000 belonging to the company itself. At the Bitcoin price at the time of the collapse, this represented approximately 480 million US dollars. At the prices Bitcoin would later reach, the number becomes almost incomprehensible. How much of this total had been lost to external theft, how much to the trading bots, and how much to other causes, human error, internal misappropriation, pure accounting confusion, remains disputed. The likeliest answer is that it was some combination of all of these, the record-keeping having been so poor for so long that untangling the causes became effectively impossible. The immediate crisis became visible to the public in early February 2014 when Mt. Gox halted all Bitcoin withdrawals. The explanation given was technical. Bitcoin transactions, the exchange announced, suffered from a vulnerability called transaction malleability, a flaw in how transaction identifiers were generated that could allow a third party to alter the ID of a pending transaction without changing its content. This, the exchange said, had been exploited to create confusion in its withdrawal processing systems, and while the issue was being resolved, withdrawals were suspended. The explanation was partially true. Transaction malleability was a real vulnerability. Other exchanges had also been affected by it. But the real reason withdrawals were halted was not transaction malleability. The real reason was that the Bitcoin was not there. For 3 weeks, Mt. Gox's hundreds of thousands of customers waited. They waited for withdrawal requests that never processed. They refreshed their account pages and watched balances that were theoretically there but practically unreachable. They posted on forums and Reddit and social media, in the early days hoping for explanations, then demanding them, then expressing a fury that had nowhere useful to go. A group of users gathered outside Mt. Gox's office in Tokyo, a modest building in the Shibuya ward, nothing about its exterior suggesting that it held responsibility for billions of dollars in customer funds. The protesters held signs and took photographs and tried to attract media attention. The media was already paying attention. The world was watching. Karpelès appeared in public only once during those 3 weeks, for a brief and uncomfortable interview in which he said almost nothing useful. He promised that the technical issues were being addressed. He expressed regret for the inconvenience. He did not look like a man who had just committed a massive fraud. He looked like a man who was in over his head and knew it. On February 24, 2014, after a document purportedly from inside Mt. Gox was leaked online, describing the full scope of the losses in stark terms, the exchange went completely dark. The website became inaccessible. Social media accounts went silent. 4 days later, on February 28, 2014, Mt. Gox filed for bankruptcy protection in Japan. The statement released with the filing was remarkable for what it contained and how briefly it contained it. In a few short sentences, it stated that approximately 850,000 Bitcoin had gone missing, representing roughly $480 million at current prices. It described the losses as resulting from weaknesses in the system that had been exploited by an external attacker. It said the company was seeking bankruptcy protection. The statement was 4 sentences long, 850,000 Bitcoin, 4 sentences. The reaction in the cryptocurrency community was unlike anything that had come before it. Bitcoin's price had already been falling during the weeks of uncertainty around Mt. Gox. After the bankruptcy announcement, it dropped further, from over $1,000 per coin to below $400 in a matter of days. The collapse of Mt. Gox had removed the exchange that processed the majority of global Bitcoin volume. The uncertainty about who could be trusted, which institutions were safe, which platforms might be hiding their own undisclosed losses, infected the entire market. People who had been skeptical of Bitcoin from the beginning saw this as confirmation of what they had always feared. The technology had been too immature to trust. The people running its infrastructure had been unqualified. The dream of a decentralized currency immune to the failures of traditional finance had proven, in practice, to be just as vulnerable to the same old failures: mismanagement, theft, inadequate oversight. Many serious people concluded at this moment that the experiment was over. They were wrong, but it was a reasonable conclusion to draw. Karpelès did not leave Japan. This was, in retrospect, notable. After the bankruptcy filing, as investigators began piecing together what had happened and as the full scale of the losses became clear, many people assumed that he would attempt to disappear, to go somewhere without an extradition treaty, to use whatever resources he had accumulated during the years of running the exchange to insulate himself from consequences. He stayed in Tokyo. He cooperated, or attempted to cooperate, with the bankruptcy proceedings. He gave interviews in which he expressed bewilderment and remorse in roughly equal measure. In August 2015, 18 months after the collapse, Japanese authorities arrested him. Japanese law allows for extended pretrial detention in ways that would be unusual in many Western legal systems. Mark spent over a year in a Japanese detention facility before formal charges were filed. By multiple accounts, the experience was deeply difficult. Extended isolation, limited outside contact, conditions that felt, to someone accustomed to the relative freedom of running a technology company, intensely oppressive. He was eventually charged with embezzlement, the allegation that he had used customer funds for personal purposes, and with data manipulation, the alteration of Mt. Gox's internal records. The trial lasted years, moving through the Japanese legal system at its characteristic deliberate pace. Witnesses were called, documents were examined. The complex technical details of how Mt. Gox's systems had worked were explained to judges who had to become, in effect, experts in a technology that barely existed when the relevant events had begun. In March 2019, Mark Karpelès was convicted of data manipulation and given a suspended sentence. He was acquitted on the embezzlement charges. The court found that he had altered records, that the data manipulation had occurred, and that he was responsible for it. But it did not find, to the standard of proof required for criminal conviction, that he had personally enriched himself with customer funds. He remains in Japan. He has spoken publicly about the events at Mt. Gox many times in the years since, on podcasts, in interviews, in various forums. His accounts are a mixture of technical explanation, expressions of genuine regret, and a kind of persistent bewilderment at how something he had intended to be useful could have ended in this way. Whether that bewilderment is genuine or performed, whether the man who ran Mt. Gox was a fraudster who has become skilled at appearing remorseful, or simply a programmer who got catastrophically in over his head, is a question that people who have followed the story closely continue to disagree about. And then, in the wreckage, something unexpected happened. During the investigation that followed the bankruptcy filing, investigators combing through Mt. Gox's records and systems made a discovery. In an old digital wallet, one that predated the exchange's later systems, that had been overlooked in the chaos of the early growth years, there was Bitcoin. 200,000 Bitcoin, just sitting there, unspent, unnoticed, in a wallet that no one had thought to look in. The discovery did not return everything that had been lost. It did not come close. The gap between what was found and what was owed was still enormous. But it was something. It was a fraction, and in the world of the Mt. Gox bankruptcy, a fraction was meaningful. The 200,000 recovered Bitcoin became the foundation of what would eventually become one of the most complex and drawn-out bankruptcy proceedings in the history of cryptocurrency. When the bankruptcy was filed in February 2014, approximately 127,000 creditors were registered. Individuals and institutions that had held Bitcoin or cash on the exchange at the time of the collapse. Some had lost relatively small amounts, a few $100s, a few Bitcoin, money they could absorb. Others had lost life savings. Businesses had lost operating capital. Individual investors had put years of accumulated holdings into what they believed was a secure platform. These 127,000 people became creditors in a bankruptcy proceeding being adjudicated under Japanese law, in Japanese courts, in a language that most of them did not speak. involving an asset class that the legal system had never had to deal with before. The years that followed were, for the creditors, a study in institutional patience being pushed far beyond its natural limits. The legal proceedings moved slowly. The technical questions were complex. The regulatory environment around cryptocurrency was uncertain and changing. Multiple rehabilitation trustees came and went. The creditors organized, formed committees, hired lawyers, filed objections, attended hearings, and waited, and waited, and waited. As they waited, the value of what they were waiting for changed in ways that made the waiting even more complicated. When the 200,000 Bitcoin were discovered, a single Bitcoin was worth a few $100s. By 2017, it had reached nearly $20,000. It fell back. Then it rose again to $60,000, then $70,000. The total value of the recovered Bitcoin fluctuated wildly, at various points representing far more than the total of all registered claims against the estate. This created a legal puzzle with significant human consequences. Under Japanese bankruptcy law, creditors were entitled to receive compensation at the value of the asset at the time of the bankruptcy filing, roughly $480 per Bitcoin in early 2014. But the value of the recovered Bitcoin had, at various points, risen to many times that amount. The excess value, the appreciation in the Bitcoin held by the estate above and beyond what was needed to pay creditors at 2014 prices, was legally destined to flow to the company's shareholders rather than to the people who had actually lost their Bitcoin. For many of the creditors, particularly those who had been early Bitcoin holders, who understood that they were not simply owed a dollar amount, but had lost a specific quantity of a specific asset that had subsequently increased dramatically in value. This felt deeply unjust. They had not lost dollars, they had lost Bitcoin, and the Bitcoin they had lost had become worth far more than the law proposed to give them back. The debates over this question consumed years of legal proceedings, multiple restructuring proposals, and an enormous amount of emotional energy from people who had already waited too long. In 2023, a rehabilitation plan was finally approved. The plan provided for distributions of Bitcoin, actual Bitcoin, not just dollar equivalents, to creditors who had been waiting for nearly a decade. The distributions began in 2024. Some creditors had been checking their email and their legal case updates every day for 10 years. Some had hired lawyers and followed every development. Some had given up, written off the loss, moved on with their lives as best they could. Some had died during the decade of waiting. The Bitcoin that eventually reached the surviving creditors was not nothing. For some, it was more than they had originally hoped for, given the circumstances. The recovered coins, combined with the rise in Bitcoin's value, allowed the estate to pay out more than many had expected in the dark months after the collapse. But 10 years is a long time to wait for what was yours. There is a particular quality to the Mt. Gox story that sets it apart from the other great disasters in cryptocurrency history. The FTX collapse, which we explored in an earlier episode, has a clear moral architecture. There is a villain. There are choices that were clearly wrong. There is a point on the map where someone decided, deliberately, to cross a line that they knew was a line. Mt. Gox does not have that clarity. What Mt. Gox has, instead, is something more ambiguous and in some ways more universal. It is a story about a system that grew faster than the people running it could understand, about infrastructure that was built for one scale and asked to operate at another, about the gap between good intentions and adequate preparation, and how, when the thing you are running holds other people's money, that gap can become a catastrophe. Mark Karpelès did not set out to steal from his customers. He set out to build something useful. The record of what happened after that, the security failures, the accounting confusion, the bots, the slow drain, is a record of what happens when useful things grow into important things and the people responsible for them do not grow at the same rate. This is not an exculpation. The customers of Mt. Gox lost real money. Some of them lost everything they had put into the platform. The years of waiting for legal resolution took a toll that cannot be calculated in Bitcoin. But it is worth noting that the disaster at Mt. Gox was not unique in its basic structure. The history of finance is full of institutions that grew faster than their controls, that were managed by people who were talented in narrow ways, but unprepared for the full scope of what they were asked to do, that collapsed under the weight of what they had become. The difference is that most of those institutions did not happen to be holding a new kind of asset in a new kind of regulatory environment, with no playbook for what to do when things went wrong. I want to leave you with something quiet tonight. The blockchain, the underlying technology that Bitcoin runs on, kept running through all of this. Through the 2011 hack and the slow drain and the trading bots and the bankruptcy filing and the decade of legal proceedings, block by block, transaction by transaction. The network that no single person or institution controls continued producing new blocks at its steady mechanical pace. This is the thing that the people who concluded the experiment was over got wrong. They looked at Mt. Gox and saw the failure of Bitcoin. What they were actually seeing was the failure of a specific institution that had been built on top of Bitcoin. The technology and the institution are not the same thing. The 127,000 creditors of Mt. Gox understood this distinction better than anyone. Many of them had not lost faith in Bitcoin during the decade of waiting. They had lost faith in a website, in a programmer who had gotten in over his head, in the absence of the systems and oversight that something so important had needed and never had. Some of them, while they waited, bought more Bitcoin. Let your breath slow. The story is a long one, and it is not entirely finished. The last creditors are only now receiving what was owed to them, 10 years after the collapse. But the blockchain is still running. The blocks are still coming, every 10 minutes or so, the way they always have. There is something steady in that, something worth carrying into sleep. Where is your money tonight? Who holds it? What would happen if the institution holding it failed tomorrow? Not questions to answer tonight, questions to carry lightly. For now, let the weight of the story settle. Let it drift somewhere distant. Good night. Word count 14,100. Estimated duration 108 minutes at 1:30 p.m.